If you want to be able to be more intentional with your song's chord progressions, rather than just using the same old stock chord progressions aimlessly over and over again, then this is the video for you. This is going to be a follow-up on a video we did previously where we talked about 3 different chord moves that I think every songwriter should know. These are going to be 3 more chord moves that I think every songwriter should know, that we should all have in our arsenal. Let's talk about it. Before we dive into the 3 different chord moves, there is something that's very important for you to understand, and that is the Roman numeral chord notation. If you've ever heard things like the 1 chord, the 2 chord, the 5 chord, the 6 chord before, basically it's that. So you can skip this next section if you already know that and just go to the next chapter, or if you don't know that, Past Joseph will explain. So basically, in the context of any key, we can give chords numbers. And in our key, the number 1 is going to be given to the name of the key. So in C major, our 1 chord would be our C major chord. Then we simply move up the scale. Our 2 chord would be a D minor chord, our 3 chord would be an E minor chord, our 4 chord would be an F major chord, and our 5 chord would be a G major chord. We're simply moving up the scale, building our chords from the notes in the scale or the notes in the key, because C major the scale and C major the key are exactly the same thing. They both are just all the natural notes or all the white keys on a keyboard. So we're simply building the chords off of the notes we have in the key. Our C, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and then finally B diminished in the context of C major. And each of these is given a number based on just what scale degree they are. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in G major, our 5 chord would be a D major chord. So we have G major, A minor, B minor, C major, D major. That would be our 5 chord. So that's all that we mean by a 1 chord and a 5 chord. A 1 chord is simply a chord built off of the 1st scale degree of the key that our song is in, and our 5 chord is built off of the 5th scale degree of the key that our song is in. All right, so now that we understand that when we say a 1 chord or a 4 chord or a 5 chord, we are simply referring to the chord that is built off of the 1st, 4th, or 5th scale degree. So with that in mind, let's talk about our first chord transition, which is going to be a 4 to a 1. Now, a 4 to a 1 is one of the most powerful transitions we have. In fact, I would argue it's probably the 2nd most powerful chord transition we have besides the 5 to 1, which we talked about in the previous video. You could think of it like a 5 begs to go to a 1, whereas a 4 just really likes to go to a 1, but it isn't quite as desperate. An example that I used in an old podcast was that 1 is home, and a 5 chord is kind of like your in-laws, where you are just desperate to get back home, and a 4 chord is more like your parents, where you kind of want to go back home, but you're not quite so desperate to go back, although once you get home it is going to feel pretty good. So this transition from a 4 chord to a 1 chord is so important that it actually is one of the 4 named cadences. If you don't know what a cadence is, basically it is a 2 chord progression that happens at the end of a phrase. So basically you could see it as the last 2 chords in the context of a chord progression, or maybe the last 2 chords of a song. Now, I mentioned that this 4 to 1 is one of the named cadences, so which one is it? It's called the Plagal cadence, otherwise known as the Amen cadence, which, when I play it for you, might start to make sense. So we'll use C major again in this video just to keep things simple, and in C major, a 4 to a 1 would be a C, D, E, F major chord to a C major chord. And that would sound something like this. Now, if I play it slightly differently, you might start to hear why it's called the Amen cadence. So if you've ever been in a traditional church service ever in your life, then you probably have heard that before. In fact, at the end of a lot of hymns, when they might have that amen part, it is always going to be this cadence. It's always going to be that 4 chord to the 1 chord. So if you want a powerful transition back to your 1 chord, but maybe you didn't want the full 5 to 1 super powerful transition, maybe a 4 to 1 is a great way to go. And just generally speaking, if you want to get back to your 1 chord, the 5 is a great way to go back to the 1 chord, but also going from a 4 back to a 1 is a great way to go as well. As far as how this chord transition is used, well, it is very often used simply throughout songs. And especially if you want that amen or amen sound at the end of your song, then a 4 to 1 is the way to go. And if we think of the most common chord progression of all, the 1, 5, 6, 4, the 4 goes back to the 1 at the beginning of the next progression. It's 1, 5, 6, 4, 1, 5, 6, 6, 4, 1. So it's going from a 4 to a 1 in the context of the most overused chord progression of all time. So perhaps it's needless to say, but you've heard this 4 to 1 transition quite a lot. It's something that's going to sound very familiar to you, and it is a great way to go, especially if you're trying to get back to the 1 chord. Now, a second chord move that I think every songwriter should know is a 5 to a 6 chord. And specifically, this is a major 5 to a minor 6, so we're talking about in the context of major keys specifically. Now, just like the major 4 to the major 1, this also is a type of cadence. This is one of the 4 named cadences. This is called a deceptive cadence. Now, the reason it's called a deceptive cadence is because a 5 chord badly wants to go back to the 1 chord, as we talked about in the previous video talking about 3 other chord moves that every songwriter should know. So if a 5 chord really badly wants to resolve to a 1, then we can actually subvert those expectations a bit and decide to not go to that major 1 chord, but instead go to a minor 6 chord. So this cadence is called deceptive because the 5 chord most wants to go to that 1 chord, but instead you're subverting those expectations and going to a minor 6 instead. So if you want the listener's ears to sort of feel like, oh, this really wants to go back to a 1 and not give them what their ears want, but instead give it a sort of sad or maybe darker twist where you're actually going to a minor chord instead, the deceptive cadence or just going from a 5 chord to a 6 chord is a great way to go. Probably the place that this is utilized the most, perhaps even to the point of cliche, is transitioning from the end of a chorus to the beginning of a bridge. So if your choruses tend to end on a 5 chord in the context of C major, a G major chord, and your verses start with a 1 chord, which also would be very common, the flow we've sort of gotten into is that at the end of every chorus, we end on a 5 chord, G major in the context of C major, and then go back to the verse with the 1 chord. But then the chorus comes along and we still end on a 5 chord, again, G major in the context of C major. But then instead of going back to the 1, the way we did with the verses, instead we go to the minor 6. So anytime you want to minorly subvert expectations and not give the listener's ear what it wants, which is that 5 to 1, but instead go in a different, probably darker direction, a 5 to 6 is a great way to go. Also of note, a lot of times when we have a bridge that goes into the relative minor key, the relative minor key is always going to be built off of what was before the minor 6 chord. So anytime you want to go into the relative minor key in your bridge, going from a 5 at the end of your chorus to the minor 6 is a great way to go, because the minor 6 in the relative minor key is actually just your 1 chord. And if we think of more usages for the 5 chord to 6 chord transition, again, we can look at the most overused chord progression of all time, the 1, 5, 6, 4. If you notice, that second part there is 5 to 6. So this is another chord transition that frankly we are used to hearing. And since the 2 chord moves we've talked about so far are actually 2 chord moves that are contained within the 1, 5, 6, 4, maybe you are starting to understand why that chord progression is so widely used and why it does, even though I kind of hate stock chord progressions and just blindly using stock chord progressions, there is a reason that that chord progression works so well in so many contexts. It does have a lot of great stuff going for it. So our third chord move that I think every songwriter should know is a minor 2 chord to a major 5 chord. So minor 2 chords are the second most common type of minor chords, next only to the minor 6 chord. And you may be in a position where you've gotten to a minor 2 chord, or you want to utilize a minor 2 chord, but now you ask, where do I go from here? And technically the answer to that question is, well, you can go anywhere from there, but a really great option is going to the 5 chord. In fact, if we expand this chord move out a little bit, just know that both for getting to a 2 chord and to go away from a 2 chord, 4 chords and 5 chords are both fantastic. So in the context of C major, our 2 chord would be a D minor chord. And again, our 5 chord in C major would be a G major chord. So a 2 to 5 would sound like this. And a 4 chord in C major would be an F major chord. So a 2 to a 4 would sound like this. So just know that if you're trying to get to a 2 chord or trying to get away from a 2 chord, both 4 chords and 5 chords are great ways to go. But we did specifically say a 2 to a 5. Why is that? Because one of the other common stock chord progressions is actually a 2-5-1. And the reason for that is because of how great 2 transitions to a 5. So that 2-5-1 chord progression would sound something like this. Or, and just for frame of reference, a 4 chord to a 2 chord would sound like this. And a 5 chord to a 2 chord like this. So if you want to be able to easily apply these principles to all of your songs in whatever keys they are in, be sure to check out my free keys cheat sheet, because that cheat sheet gives you every single note and all the main chords, all the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 chords in every single key. So be sure to check that out. It's at songwritertheory.com/keys, my free gift to you. Go out and utilize these chord moves, and I will talk to you in the next one.